Rain hammered the tin roof of the storm hut hard enough to shake the walls. Inside, two boys stood breathing hard in the narrow space, water running from their hair and down their necks. Adam dragged his soaked shirt over his head and tossed it aside. Across from him, Caleb hesitated only a second before doing the same. The air inside the hut felt suddenly smaller. For a moment, neither of them moved. Outside, the ridge had disappeared behind the sheet of rain. Inside, the space between them was barely wide enough to stand without touching. Adam's hand moved first. Caleb did not step away. The storm drowned everything else. By the time the rain passed over the valley, nothing between them would be the same. Because their story had begun long before the storm reached the ridge. This is Men Being Too Intimate Season 3. The Storm Hut. Morning settled low across the eastern paddocks. Sheep grazed in slow clusters, heads down, tearing at the shorter grass. Caleb worked along the boundary fence with his father, replacing a post that had begun to tilt near the dip in the ridge. He had turned 21 last month. He checked the angle twice before lifting the hammer. The first strike landed clean. The second drove deeper. He worked without hurry. He preferred finishing a section properly rather than fixing it later. The wire along this stretch had loosened where the flock leaned when the wind came up from the valley. He pulled it through the staple and drew it tight until the tension settled into his palms. Across the ridge, movement caught his eye. On the western slope, Adam was working the same line from his side. The western paddock fell away more sharply toward the creek. The grass was thinner here, cropped close where the sheep gathered near the waterline. A young heading dog moved along the outer edge of the flock, circling wide before tightening its path at a whistle. Adam stood with one boot braced against a post, pulling wire through with both hands. "Easy," his father called to the dog. The whistle changed. The dog shifted direction at once, pressing the sheep back from the boundary. Adam glanced across the ridge. He spotted Caleb working along the eastern line. Adam lifted his hammer and raised his arm high above his head in a loose wave. The sudden movement caught Caleb off guard. A short laugh slipped out of him before he could stop it. He jumped in return, waving high, exaggerated, almost ridiculous. Caleb lowered his arms and picked up the hammer again. His own father followed his line of sight. "Adam's side's gone slack near the creek," he said. "Saw it yesterday." "You should give him a hand once you're done here." Caleb nodded. "I'll head over after this stretch." His father nodded once. Caleb drove the last strike into the post. The sound carried clean across the paddock. Adam's father glanced over from a few meters away. "What's that about?" "Nothing." His father looked across the ridge, then back at Adam. He stepped in close and ran a rough hand through his son's hair, pushing it forward. "Oi," Adam muttered, swatting lightly at his wrist. His father rubbed the back of his neck once before stepping away. "Heading into town," his father said, nodding toward the ute. "You able to handle this?" Adam wiped his hands against his jeans. "Course." His father studied him for a second, then tapped him once on the shoulder as he passed. Right then, the ute started. Gravel shifted under the tires as it rolled down the track. The dog settled at Adam's heel. Across the ridge, Caleb had moved further down his side. Adam bent to the wire again and pulled until the tension settled into his hands. By the time Caleb reached the dip near the creek, the eastern stretch stood straight. His dog moved ahead, nose low, before lifting its head at the sight of the other side. Adam was already there, working the same section from the western line. His dog circled close, then crossed the boundary without hesitation, tail cutting through the grass. Both dogs wove between them, brushing legs, trading scents as if the fence was only suggestion. Adam looked up first. About time. Caleb stepped clean over the lower strand. "Had to fix your mess." Adam grinned and stepped forward. He caught Caleb's forearm in a firm grip and pulled him in hard for a brief shoulder knock. Before Caleb could reset his stance, Adam hooked an arm loosely around the back of his neck and gave him a quick shake. "Still slow." Caleb let out a short burst of laughter, sharper than he expected, and pushed him off. The dog circled tighter, pressing against their legs. Caleb bent to rub Adam's dog along its flank. Adam scratched behind Caleb's dog's ears without thinking. "Creek soft," Adam said. "Yeah." They took opposite sides of the leaning post. Caleb gripped the wire. Adam braced the timber. "Ready?" "Yep." They pulled together. The wire resisted at first. Caleb planted his heels. Adam stepped closer to add weight. The tension settled into Caleb's palms. Adam's arm pressed along his side, steady and warm through worn cotton. The vibration ran through the post and into both of them before easing. They remained close for a second longer than necessary before stepping apart. The dogs settled near their boots. They moved down the creek section in quiet coordination, switching roles without discussion. When the final stretch stood straight, Adam stepped back and looked along the boundary. That'll do. Caleb followed his line of sight. The wire ran clean through the dip without sagging. Adam lifted his hand without looking at him. Caleb met it in a firm clap, palms striking once before their fingers hooked briefly and released. The sound carried across the creek bed. The dog startled at the noise, then settled again. Adam dropped his hand. Lunch? Caleb glanced toward the flat rock above the rise. Yeah. They headed uphill together, dogs pacing ahead, the fence holding behind them. The flat rock sat above the ridge where both paddocks could be seen at once. The grass thinned around it from years of boots and dogs circling the same ground. The dogs settled first. Caleb's dropped heavily into the shade. Adam circled once before lying close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Caleb sat and stretched his legs out. He pulled a wrapped sandwich and handed one across. Caleb took it without looking, already watching the lower paddock where the sheep moved in loose clusters. Tom messaged, Adam said. Yeah? Got himself a girlfriend. Caleb looked over. Tom? Yeah. You're joking. Adam let out a short laugh, thought he'd be last. They grinned at each other for a second before looking back at the paddock. Reckon he'll stay up there now. Probably. Adam leaned back on his elbows. Everyone's heading off. Caleb finished the last of his sandwich. James is up there too. Caleb nodded. He posted something. Yeah? With some bloke. The dogs lifted their heads briefly, sensing the shift in tone. Didn't he used to go out with Jen? Caleb asked. Yeah. Adam picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. Looks like he's doing all right, though. Caleb kept his eyes forward. Adam shifted slightly closer without meaning to. You ever think about it? He asked. Caleb glanced at him. About what? Adam held his gaze for a second, then looked away. Heading off. Caleb leaned back on his palms. Sometimes? Adam nodded once. The wind strengthened across the ridge. The light dulled. Adam looked toward the horizon. Better move them before that turns. Caleb followed his gaze. They whistled for the dogs and stood at the same time. The sheep began to bunch. They stepped off the rock at the same time. The dogs were already alert. Caleb whistled first, long and low. His dog broke wide across the eastern paddock, cutting off a small group of ewes drifting toward the gully. The flock angled uphill under steady pressure. Across the boundary, Adam lifted 2 fingers to his mouth and sent his own dog out in a wide arc. The western flock responded separately, tightening into movement toward the higher gate on his side. They worked in parallel without speaking. Caleb jogged toward the eastern gate and swung it open. Sheep funneled through in a steady line. His dog held the rear until the last A-way cleared the fence. Metal latched shut. On the western side, Adam drove his flock through and pulled the gate closed with one firm motion. He checked the chain twice before stepping back. The dog circled once, waiting. Home, Caleb called. His dog turned immediately and ran downhill toward the shed below the ridge. Caleb wiped his hands against his jeans and looked up. Cloud had gathered thick over the valley, darker than it had been moments ago. He lifted 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled sharp across the ridge. Adam paused mid-step and looked up. Caleb pointed toward the sky. Adam studied it for a second, then shouted back across the wind. Beer after? The corner of Caleb's mouth lifted. The first drop hit hard against the dust near his boot. Then another. Within seconds, the rain came heavy and immediate. The far ridge blurred behind a sheet of gray. Caleb whistled again, shorter this time, 2 quick bursts. He pointed down toward the hut. Adam nodded once. They started running from their separate sides. The small tin hut sat near the old gorse line at the base of the ridge, half hidden from both sides. Rain thickened fast, soaking through denim and cotton in seconds. The ground softened underfoot. Caleb ran first, boots hitting uneven patches of grass. Halfway down the slope, he glanced sideways and saw Adam cutting across from the western rise, taking the longer angle. Caleb slowed and turned back uphill instead of continuing down. They met in the middle of the slope, rain already streaming from their hair. Neither said anything. Then they broke into a full sprint toward the hut, shoulder to shoulder, boots slipping as the ground softened under them. The hut was smaller than it looked from the ridge. They hit the doorway at the same time and shouldered inside. Rain pounded the roof so hard it drowned out everything else. They stood there for a second, bent forward slightly, hands on thighs, catching breath. Water ran from their hair, down their faces, along their necks. Their shirts clung dark and heavy against skin. Adam straightened first. "You look cooked." Caleb pushed wet hair back from his forehead. "Seen yourself?" Adam snorted once. Water flicked from his sleeve as he shook his arm out. Caleb let out a short laugh, sharper than he expected. It echoed strangely in the small space. Adam dragged his hands down his face and squeezed water from the hem of his shirt. Caleb leaned back against the wall. Water dripped steadily from the hem of Caleb's shirt onto the packed dirt floor. Adam tugged at his own collar and pulled the fabric away from his chest, the cotton sticking stubbornly. He gripped the back of his shirt and dragged it over his head in one motion. The wet fabric peeled free and dropped heavily to the floor. Caleb watched without meaning to. Rain pounded harder against the roof. Adam ran both hands through his hair and shook out the water. His skin was flushed from the run, cooler now in the air of the hut. Caleb looked down at his own shirt. It clung to him just as badly. He pulled it up slower, the fabric resisting at his shoulders before coming free. He dropped it beside Adam's. The space between them felt smaller now. Adam rubbed his arms briskly for warmth. Their eyes met briefly, then shifted away. Caleb cleared his throat. "Beer?" Adam let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Caleb crouched near the corner and pulled 2 cans free. He handed one across. Their fingers brushed longer than necessary. Adam cracked his open. The sound was sharp under the rain. They sat down side by side against the wall, shoulders almost touching, knees bent. Outside, the storm settled into a steady sheet. Inside, the air held the heat of their bodies. Adam lifted his can and took a long drink without looking at Caleb. Caleb watched the rain trace lines down the window before speaking. "Haven't seen you with anyone." Adam let out a quiet breath. "Anyone what? Just anyone." Adam turned his head slightly. "What are you on about?" Caleb's mouth shifted, almost a smile. "I'm serious." Adam studied him for a second, then looked down at the can in his hands. "You ever think about it?" Caleb kept his voice even. "About getting out of here?" Adam held his gaze this time. "About blokes." The word sat between them. Adam exhaled. Caleb didn't look away. After a second, he gave a small nod. Adam's throat moved once. He nodded back. They both took another drink. Their stretched-out legs shifted as they settled deeper against the wall. Caleb's foot brushed against Adam's ankle. The contact stayed. Neither of them looked up. Their eyes stayed on the place where their boots touched. Rain moved steadily over the roof. Caleb's foot shifted slightly against Adam's. Adam exhaled slowly. Caleb glanced up just briefly. Adam was already watching him now. The distance between them was small enough that Caleb could feel the warmth from Adam's shoulder. His eyes closed. Their faces were close now without either remembering when they leaned in. Adam's thumb moved once, slow. Caleb's hand found Adam's jaw. Then Adam closed the distance. The first kiss was not clean. Their noses knocked lightly. Caleb turned his head the wrong way before correcting. Adam let out a breath against his mouth that almost sounded like a laugh. They tried again, softer this time. Their lips pressed and held. Rain drowned everything else. Caleb met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. Adam leaned in and kissed him again, deeper, slower, no longer unsure. The hut felt smaller. Adam lifted his head slightly. Their eyes met at close distance. Caleb didn't look away. Adam brushed his thumb along Caleb's cheekbone once. The storm continued outside, steady and unseen. Inside the hut, everything narrowed to breath, warmth, and the steady press of bodies learning each other for the first time. The air inside the hut cooled quickly once their breathing slowed. Adam shifted slightly. "You cold?" Caleb shook his head once. "Nah." Adam pressed closer anyway. For a while they listened to the rain thinning across the roof. The storm had moved further down the valley. The hut no longer felt like shelter from something urgent. It just felt small. "You reckon we're gonna be all right?" Adam looked up. "About what?" Caleb breathed out slowly. About this. Adam lifted his head slightly so he could see Caleb's face. I don't reckon I want to head off. Caleb studied him. Adam shrugged once. Used to think I did. Everyone goes on about it like you're meant to. Caleb nodded faintly. Yeah, but I can see it here, working the place. Doing it right. He hesitated, then added quieter, doing it our way. Caleb's chest rose slowly beneath him. You and me? Adam held his gaze. Yeah. Caleb swallowed once. Dad reckons I'll bail first chance I get. Mine too. Caleb looked up at the timber beams overhead. Adam shifted slightly so their foreheads almost touched. Caleb turned his head back toward him. I've got you. The words sat there, heavier than anything they had said so far. Adam nodded once. I see myself here with you. He pressed his forehead lightly against Caleb's. We'll be right. Caleb let out a slow breath. Outside, the storm had passed beyond the ridge. The air left behind was colder, clearer. Inside the hut, they stayed tangled together, no longer avoiding what they had just said. The cold settled in properly once they shifted apart. Caleb pushed himself up slowly. Adam was still working the button when Caleb reached out. He took over without a word, fingers steady as he closed it for him. Adam stilled. They leaned into each other once more, arms wrapping naturally. When they pulled back, they both reached for their shirts. The fabric was still damp. Adam pressed it to his chest and winced. Nah. Caleb huffed a laugh. They stepped out of the hut barebacked, boots sinking slightly into soft ground. The walk back up the ridge was long and quiet at first. Their hands brushed once, then again. Caleb reached out this time and took Adam's hand fully. Adam looked down at it, then back at him. They walked like that across the open stretch, the valley below them clear again. When they reached the fork where the boundary fence split their land, they stopped. Adam rubbed the back of his neck. We should stock the place with something stronger, Caleb snorted. Bourbon. Adam stepped in first and pressed a quick, firm kiss to Caleb's mouth. When he pulled back, Caleb reached up and brushed Adam's hair away from his forehead, smoothing it back gently. Caleb's thumb lingered once near his temple before dropping. They stepped apart. See you tomorrow. Yeah. Adam turned first, heading toward the western rise. Halfway across, when he turned, he saw Caleb jump once and wave both arms over his head. Adam laughed and turned, thumping his fist once against his chest before pointing toward Caleb. Caleb grinned wide. Then they turned back toward their own land. An ISTJ builds life the way a fence line is built. Post by post, wire drawn tight. Work done carefully enough that it will still hold years later. For Caleb, staying was never about fear of leaving. It was about responsibility, about carrying forward what had been trusted to him. An ISTP moves differently through the world. Hands first. Instinct before explanation. Trust built through what proves itself in the moment. For Adam, the future was never something to plan out loud. It was something to test, to feel. Caleb chose something that could endure. Adam chose something that felt solid and real. An ISTJ and an ISTP. Different ways of seeing the world. But sometimes the strongest lines are the ones that meet in the middle. This is Men Being 2 Intimate Season 3. The Storm Hut. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share for more stories on gay audiobooks. Also my short novel, Men Being 2 Intimate series, The Rules of the Dance, The Boy Who Slept Against Me, Under the Eyes of Set, and more are now available on Kindle Unlimited. You'll find the link in the description. Hope you check it out and enjoy. Thank you.